Good afternoon. Happy Friday. Happy spring feeling Friday, too. Thank you all. We're so glad you could join us this afternoon for this symposium. We're excited about it. As you know, every year the Collegiate Council, which is our representative body, every department has representation, and various constituency groups have representation. And so every year we try to bring something to the faculty and staff of the college that will challenge us, help us learn some new things, get us to think about some things maybe we haven't thought about before. And so as the council considered various ideas and thoughts about how they wanted to do this forum this year, they started thinking about really this is their planning, and I'm just welcoming you. But they really started thinking about what this year has been like for all of us. And of course, it's been many, many things, many difficult and challenging things, and really started raising the question about, creativity is really the force that produces and propels much of the work that we do. And people started thinking about how challenging it has been in many ways to be creative in this time period, and how stuck in our houses, and even when we're teaching classes and those kinds of things, and taking care of our family while we're teaching classes, all of those things, that it's really been a difficult thing to do. And one of the major forces for creativity for us is face-to-face interactions, particularly those interactions with people who are not necessarily the people with whom we would normally speak or with whom we would normally engage. And so the idea that kind of in what started out as a lockdown and is not a lockdown anymore, that our minds could also become locked down, metaphorically speaking, and that we also are kind of in a social and political climate that is so fraught with one side and the other side, and opposing camps and kind of entrenched ideas, that we wanted, that the council wanted to talk today, to have an opportunity to explore how we address this. Because even though we're coming out of this period, it's a gradual process. It's not going to happen immediately. And the implications of what has happened for us are going to be with us for a long time. So with that kind of framing in mind of what they were thinking about, and they will, I'm sure, tell you more, we're thinking about both how we create a post-COVID future that will re-engage and re-inspire us in some new and exciting ways. And this panel is really kind of a launch pad for that. So again, I thank you for coming out and welcome you again. And I turn it over to the next person, Lisa Nathans from TDPS.
Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for that welcome, Dean. Greatly appreciated. So my name is Lisa Nathans, and I am an assistant professor of voice and acting in the School of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies. I'm thrilled to be welcoming you all to our Collegiate Council, our plenary for this spring semester. As Dean Thornton introduced, the theme of our plenary today is stumbling towards creativity, overcoming our closed minds. We have 4 panelists that we've gathered that are going to be presenting about 10 minutes, sharing how they've been thinking about this theme with each of you, and then we'll have time for some question and answer at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first panelist. I'd like to introduce Ari Kruglanski. Ari Kruglanski is Distinguished University Professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Maryland and a Fellow of the American Psychological Association and the American Psychological Society. He is the co-author of the 2019 book, The Three Pillars of Radicalization: Needs, Narratives, and Networks, and author of the 2004 book, The Psychology of Closed-Mindedness. His work in the domains of human judgment and belief formation, the motivation-cognition interface, group and intergroup processes, and the psychology of human goals has been disseminated in over 400 articles, chapters, and books, and has been continuously supported by grants from the National Science Foundation, NIMH, Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, the Ford Foundation, and the Israeli Academy of Science. As a founding co-PI and co-director of START, National Center for the Study of Terrorism and the Response to Terrorism, Kruglanski also conducts research with the support of grants from the Department for Homeland Security and from the Department of Defense on the psychological processes behind radicalization, de-radicalization, and terrorism. Please help me welcome Dr. Kruglanski. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for this very gracious introduction, and good afternoon to all. I'm very pleased and privileged and honored to be here to share with you some of my ideas about closed-mindedness. From the psychological standpoint, a major impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has been the introduction of a knowing anxiety, evoking uncertainty in millions of people. The uncertainty is anxiety evoking because it's connected with multiple negative possibilities. It's betokens the possibility of severe illness, economic failure, isolation, losing one's loved ones, and so forth. So this angst evokes the motivation to escape the uncertainty. And we call this motivation the need for cognitive closure. Basically, the need for closure is the desire to have certainty, to have a definite answer to a question, and to avoid ambiguity. It is a dimension that on which people stably vary. Some people desire certainty and closure more than other people. And there is a scale that we devised and others much improved that has been translated into multiple languages and that allows the measurement of the need for closure that characterizes each individual. The need for closure can also be induced by the situation. Basically, any circumstance that makes uncertainty aversive, unpleasant, and threatening can evoke the need for closure. The uncertainty evoked by the COVID-19 pandemic is one such circumstance. But there are other circumstances, much more mundane, that can also evoke the need for closure. Time pressure, when not having closure means missing an important deadline, arouses the need for closure. Environmental noise that makes information processing difficult arouses the need for closure. Mental fatigue, when you simply lack the energy to process information, arouses the need to be done with it and have closure. Intoxication by alcohol reduces one's cognitive capacity, making information processing difficult, and that also increases the need for closure. So by now, there is ample empirical evidence that each of these situational conditions can induce the need for closure. Now, what is the effect of this need for closure, the need for certainty, on our psychic functioning? Simply, when closure or certainty becomes our objective, we do all we can to attain it. And how do we do so? We do so very simply by latching onto any information, any suggestion that offers closure. In our epistemic theory, we talk about a seizing and freezing sequence. You seize on the first information that affords closure, and you freeze upon it so that you become relatively impervious to any subsequent information that is relevant to the topic. And then will therefore fall on deaf ears, as it were. Why do we have this capacity to desire closure? And is it a curse or a blessing? It turns out that it's both a curse and a blessing, but first and foremost, it's a necessity. Without it, we would not know where to stop our gathering of information to make a judgment and decision. And this would make life as we know it virtually impossible, because our life is built on a string of judgment and decisions, for each of which we require a certain threshold degree of certainty. And there is no unique point at which our information gathering must stop. There's no objective signal, no sign from heaven to tell us when enough is enough. Such mechanism, therefore, is subjective. And this is precisely our need for closure that tell us enough. We do not need any more information. We have enough. We can now make a judgment. We can now undertake a decision. We can now initiate action. How can a need for closure be a curse and a blessing? And generally, what is the impact of this need for closure on our individual and our social and societal lives? The 19th century philosopher John Stuart Mill once said that all social phenomena have their root in the human nature, and the pervasive impacts of the need for closure are an essential part of the human nature, poignantly illustrates and validates John Stuart Mill's assertion. How does it do so? A major curse, a major drawback, if you will, of the need for closure is that it can lead to tragic mistakes caused by premature closure. Barbara Tuchman, the historian, in her well-known work, The March of Folly, details a string of historic disasters. She calls it from Troy to Vietnam, that happened because the decision makers froze on a prior conception and refused to pay attention to available information that, if only taken into account, would have avoided the disaster. Many sneak attacks that resulted in serious military debacles are attributable to such freezing on conceptions. With an Israeli colleague, a political scientist, Uri Bar Yosef, I recently analyzed one such sneak attack by Egypt and Syria in October 1973, the so-called Yom Kippur War on Israel. And Israel was totally shocked by this attack, completely surprised, even though there has been detailed warnings from the very best spy Israel ever had, Ashran Marwan, the son of no less than Egypt's charismatic president, Gamal Abdel Nasser. So beyond the disasters of premature closure, a major problem caused by this need is the tendency to uncritically accept simplistic schemes, stereotypes, prejudices, conspiracy theories that we have seen proliferate these days in the United States and the world in general. And these theories, of course, are pernicious in that they cause the fragmentation of society by designating a given group of people, people of color, immigrants, Jews, Muslims, Asians, as the enemy. And of course, relevant to the present symposium, the need for closure closes our mind and therefore limits creativity, limits exploration. A heightened need for closure informs our politics as well. In a 1993 meta-analysis of 50 years of research on political conservatism, we have shown that conservatives have a higher need for closure than do liberals. Indeed, conservative political attitudes are closure preserving. They represent resistance to change, resistance to diversity that undermines uniform culture, preference for local versus global government, insofar as local government, by definition, is more homogeneous and less diverse than a global government. Finally, a high need for closure disposes people to favor an autocratic governance structure because autocracy suppresses debate and diverse points of view and promotes the uncritical acceptance of opinions that are given from the top. All these impacts that I mentioned so far may seem negative, curses that a high need for closure brings about? What about some blessings of the need for closure? In the cognitive realm, for one, it prevents people to succumb to paralysis by obsessive overanalysis, and it affords action. And in the social realm, it strengthens commitment and consistency, commitment to one's family, commitment to one's country, commitment to one's profession, to one's ideals. It also strengthens group cohesion and group consensus, attributes that enhance the group's capacity for action. And indeed, conservatives often seem to be more united and more action-oriented than liberals. Be that however it may, the indispensable psychological mechanism that we call the need for cognitive closure drives important social phenomena on the interpersonal, and societal levels of analysis. It has its functions, it has its trade-offs, and the wisdom, of course, consists of knowing when to close one's mind and when to unfreeze it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kruglanski. Can everyone hear me? Hopefully. All right, so now to our second panelist, Marina Song. Marina Song is Associate Professor of Piano at University of Maryland School of Music. She has performed around the globe in almost every state in the continental United States, as well as Canada, Russia, Sweden, Italy, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and China. Fanfare magazine called her a genius, pure and simple, perhaps a wizard. Her first CD of Romantic Russian piano music was released by Centaur Records in 2008 and won a Global Music Award and rave reviews. She is currently engaged in her next recording project of Haydn piano sonatas. Professor Song is also co-chair of the School of Music's Idea Committee, which was created to immediately mobilize its membership to consider specific ways the school will respond to recent events and make the School of Music more inclusive, diverse, equitable, and accessible. So without further ado, I pass it on to Professor Marina Song.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to share some of my personal thoughts and experiences over this last year. And so to begin with, I have to say that to me, creativity and aspects of that were actually stoked by the pandemic once I accepted that this was going to be our life for a while. And approximately a year ago, when COVID started taking hold, I had traveled with my 3-year-old daughter to Alberta, Canada, to judge a music festival and to play and to give a piano masterclass in the Edmonton area. And these were all gigs that were conventional in style, in repertoire, in format. And it turned out that all of these events ended up being canceled suddenly. And little did I know at that time how the cancellation would come to really mean transformation in the musical world on a global scale for more than a year. And that we would be living out of 2 suitcases and a stroller for the next 8 months in Canada. In terms of work, suddenly teaching and judging were only possible online. And not only was the sound quality of live piano playing over FaceTime, Skype, Zoom, Google Duo often terrible, but it was also very much interrupted at times by lapses in internet connection. But the students also needed to scramble suddenly to even find instruments to practice on. During those early days and beyond, I heard Liszt Sonata on a spinet with missing keys. I heard Schumann Fantasy on a grand piano that was stuffed into a closet. I heard Chopin's Fantasy Impromptu on an old electric clavinova that had no pedal, which at least was in tune. And teaching, as I had known it, had pretty much disappeared overnight. And listening for a living became a source of great angst. I felt like I was becoming a much worse teacher for it. So like the famous Zen poem, "My house burned down and now I can see the moon," the beliefs that I had attached to my former privileged context of live performance essentially went up in smoke. But also, like the poem, what eventually emerged was a path more about opportunities and less about obstacles. And I credit my students, and not only mine, but others that I heard, and my work on the idea committee as the catalysts for the change. In lessons, I started to notice that if I turned down the volume, which in the beginning, I have to say I did more times than I'm proud to admit, students essentially looked the same in spite of whatever keyboard they were playing in whatever time zone in the world. And what I mean by that is not only physically they looked the same, but also sort of energy-wise, psychologically. They didn't complain, they weren't martyrs, they were just as committed, and some even got COVID twice. And they just simply didn't give up. And that kind of inner strength and desire to make music at all costs was extremely inspiring to me. All to say that I felt a very strong desire to find a more positive attitude and productive approach to this new way of teaching for my own sake and also that of the students. So with many hours of fixed camera angles, I began to really watch and at times, very closely identifying certain areas of tension, studying body language, literally with a close-up lens, focusing intently on the physiology of a student's hand, the knuckles of the fingers, arm, body, and so forth. And was it healthy? Did it suit the musical gesture? If not, how to suggest adjustments and by what increments? Another interesting shift happened when the balance of responsibility between teacher and student was adjusted. At the School of Music, we started asking students to send recordings of themselves in advance of their lessons, as the sound quality was much improved this way. And so I started asking for more self-critique and rationale for their choices of recordings that they would send me. And often we would talk about their development of self-teaching skills, how they listen to themselves and their own solutions for problems. Also, about a year ago, I became chair of the Idea Committee at the School of Music, which promotes inclusion, diversity, equity, and access in our community. And my official work there now is centered around community engagement. But because of my involvement with the Renegade series and exposure to more diversity in general, through monthly meetings, I had the opportunity to meet and host some extraordinary thinkers and creative people who successfully forged paths for themselves despite some extremely isolating forces, which of course were in existence long before COVID. And the comments I hear from students on the committee and the relationships formed there have really opened my eyes, ears, and heart, not only to diverse repertoire, but also to a more humble and a deeper understanding of humanity. I feel lucky to have had this time to digest some of these ideas and to feel a sincere change from within. For example, we just went through our yearly audition cycle, and this year we had more diversity in the piano applicant pool than ever before, perhaps due to the fact that no one needed to travel to live auditions and incur costs. I found myself listening more to more than sound, watching body language, noticing the way students would introduce themselves, how they put their materials together, noticing their surroundings, noticing what kind of access to what kinds of instruments did these students have. And I found that I really wanted to have conversations with these prospective students to inquire about their individual stories. Also, recently, as a performer, I accepted an invitation to play a concert of Latin American classical solo piano music by Mexican composer Manuel Ponce, who was a contemporary of Maurice Ravel. And the concert is part of a bigger mission called the Ponce Project. It's based in Houston, and it aims to make Latin American classical music part of the standard piano repertoire. Now, truthfully, I may not have accepted the invitation before now, partly due to the unfamiliarity of the repertoire, but probably more likely due to a sort of closed-mindedness and fear of imperfection and failure. However, having weathered some challenging situations of the last year, the difference now is I feel much more open to the messiness of discovery that goes along with expanding in this direction, and I'm really looking forward to the program. So reflecting on how the pandemic actually hit us during the 250th anniversary of Beethoven's birth, it really is fascinating to see how this massive commemoration played out in some expected but also unexpected ways. Notable comparisons with our recent challenges are Beethoven's deafness, his subsequent despair and isolation, the unintelligible sounds that came from his keyboard when he attempted to hide his deafness from the world, and his increasingly untidy appearance. The way that Beethoven dealt with this deafness is one of the great stories of humanity, of course, and not just of music or creating sound. And finally, to witness the cathartic desire for students and me to move on from Beethoven and explore music of the world was an unexpected growth. And so to conclude, I would just like to share that I received my second shot yesterday, and it is interesting to me that if a vaccine had been developed just 1 month, 2 months, or maybe even 3 months after coronavirus took hold, I may not have experienced the same kind of opening that I did. It really took time for that beautiful house with great acoustics to burn down, and for a messier, imperfect kind of creativity to take root. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Song. Lovely, lovely. We're going to get to hear more from all of our panelists after we get to hear from our last two presenters during our Q&A. So without further ado, I move forward to introduce Jason Farman. Jason Farman is Professor of American Studies and Director of the Design, Cultures, and Creativity Program at the University of Maryland. He is also a faculty member with the Human-Computer Interaction Lab and a faculty associate with Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. He is author of the books Delayed Response, The Art of Waiting, From the Ancient to the Instant World, Yale University Press, 2018, and Mobile Interface Theory, Embodied Space and Locative Media, Routledge, 2012. Mobile Interface Theory was the winner of the 2012 Book of the Year Award from the Association of Internet Researchers. Professor Farman has edited 2 collections and published scholarly articles on such topics as mobile technologies, Google Maps, social media, video games, digital storytelling, digital performance art, and surveillance. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Professor Farman.
Great, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here and situate all of our talks together. This is fantastic. So I wrote a book about waiting in 2018, and that book confronted me over the last year, asking me to put into practice all of the things that I had talked about. And I feel like waiting has come to characterize so much of our lives over the last year, where we're waiting for a vaccine, we're waiting for a word from schools about what classes might look like in the coming semester. People are waiting for jobs to return. People are even just waiting for the Zoom host to finally start the meeting. As our lives have moved into remote connections, we wait as we're put on hold for the next customer service representative. We are waiting for the internet company to finally upgrade our speed so we can teach from home. We're waiting for the bureaucracies of unemployment benefits or stimulus checks. We wait for normal life to return, and it's as if we've all become living buffering icons with no sense of when that waiting will cease. Many are bored, unproductive, we're irritated by the wait times, and the ways that waiting itself makes us feel powerless and anxious, isolated and depressed. We hate to wait even for very short periods of time. And in so many of our moments of waiting, there's no feedback about when our waiting will end. There's no closure to that. So we're left with all of these complex emotions that center around that term uncertainty that we use. But there is a way for us to reclaim waiting from the slow and thick doldrums of these negative encounters with delays. I believe that we can wait better, but I think that that requires us to radically reorient our perspectives on waiting. In the book that I wrote, Delayed Response, I look at the ways historically waiting has always been a moment of interpretation for us. We use these delays and we fill them with meaning. So I look particularly at messages and message exchanges as we wait for word from people around the world throughout history and the message exchanges that we've had. And these moments of delay and how we interpret them are really meaningful tools for how we understand human connection and intimacy, especially as we're spread out, especially as we connect remotely like we are in this moment. And throughout it all, really, these moments of time are content for us to interpret. Time is content, time is meaningful for us. So I end the book by encouraging us to become students of waiting, to develop tactics for waiting, to wait better. Waiting really calls attention to itself, unlike other moments and other experiences of time. And if we begin to pay attention to waiting more, I think it can be an instructive teacher. It teaches us about things like power dynamics, about who or who isn't forced to wait, who can skip the line. It teaches about cultural notions of productivity and efficiency. I think all of us have felt that very deeply over this last year. What does it mean to be productive in this time as we're waiting to return to a different kind of life or a sense of normalcy? Waiting can teach us about how knowledge is produced and the time required to produce that knowledge, and how meaning is linked with temporality. So I use the term tactics very deliberately, thinking about Michel Desserteau's notion of tactics as an approach, a way to deal with the strategies that are imposed upon us. So wait times can be really instructive for us, especially in our creative pursuits and our development of knowledge, but we actually have to let ourselves to wait first off, which is for me one of the more difficult things. I approach this topic knowing very well that I'm awful at waiting. I actually despise it. I'm impatient and I don't, I pull out my phone at every moment I have where I'm standing in line or waiting for something. So for me, it was very much about just letting myself wait to learn from it. In these moments of waiting, the strategies that we can develop for how to deal with waiting is first asking a simple question about why you're waiting and ultimately who benefits from that waiting. Oftentimes we are the beneficiaries of our own waiting. It develops patience. Waiting can be seen in investment as an investment, such as putting money in a retirement account, for example, and letting it sit and waiting on it. We have notions of delayed gratification, of learning to wait as a positive character trait. But ultimately as well, waiting can reveal how people in positions of power can structurally benefit by making others wait. Part of the work that I did was looking at scholarship around design practices of waiting rooms and welfare offices in South America and how the very design of this feeds uncertainty because there is no sense or feedback about when your waiting will end, whether or not you actually get what you came for. And it creates a sense of powerlessness within that space. And this carries over into so many encounters in daily life, like a boss who makes an employee cool their heels in a waiting room, or even in romantic relationships where there's a certain priority of time given to somebody who makes the other person wait. Roland Barthes talks about this in A Lover's Discourse, that the lover's identity is the one who waits, as the other person claims priority of time. So it's worth us asking, how are we making others wait as we're waiting in this moment as well? Are there people in our lives that we're exercising power over by imposing wait times on them? So two key themes really emerged for me as I did this work is that waiting is a way that power is exercised, both culturally and interpersonally, but also waiting can be a collective experience of time rather than simply an individual one. So one of the reasons that we feel that waiting is such a burden is that we believe that our time is unique from others. In contemporary Western societies, we tend to value individual time over collective time. But if we imagine shifting our perspectives on time and imagining how my time is intertwined with yours, we can begin to think about how my wait times can be an investment in the social fabric. My wait times can be an investment in you. Communication scholar Sarah Sharma talks about this in her book, In the Meantime, where she talks about the contradictions of the digital age, where we're centering on these moral imperatives of using our time wisely, while simultaneously critiquing those who have to use their time to negotiate with social structures that demand that they're using their time in radically different ways than I use my time. So their time is imposed differently on them than it is on me. Yet I have very different notions of what it means to use time wisely and to kind of rise to the moral imperative of using that time well. So if I imagine how my time is intertwined with your time, a new moral imperative emerges where it benefits me to see you use your time well as our time is connected with each other. And by working toward an awareness that sees time as collective rather than individual, we're investing in one another. And I think this has the radical ability to build empathy and calls for social change as we begin to realize that not everyone is afforded the same agency in how time gets used in a day. Time is unevenly distributed. And that to me was one of the surprises of this. I imagine, hey, we've all got 24 hours. Success depends on how you use that 24 hours, which is just absolutely not true. People are forced to use their times in radically different ways from each other. Within that 24 hours, time is definitely unevenly distributed. And it benefits me to wait alongside you, to imagine how certain structures are putting you at a disadvantage in life. And I think finally, as we become students of waiting, we can learn so much about ourselves and our creative practices by embracing waiting within our lives. So while waiting is not a universal positive, there are moments when people are really put at a disadvantage with how they're made to wait. There are moments when waiting can truly deeply benefit us, both as creative and creative researchers, how we can embrace wait times in order to unlock new modes of creativity. Cognitively, when we begin to wait and we're bored and we begin to daydream and we have moments of pause, this unlocks what's called the default network of the brain, which is often referred to as the imagination network, where daydreaming and waiting allow you to access ways of thinking that you could not have found if you sought them out. They require you to be on pause. And we imagine within our lives that productivity is really just working hard all the time and filling every hour of the day with really meaningful things to do. And waiting typically does not fit into that structure. But if we allow ourselves to imagine wait times as being very productive for our creative pursuits and our own research, I think we can really shift our notions of productivity and embrace waiting as a key element of that. Let yourself be paused rather than imagining as a burden. So if we can build in tactics of waiting, tactics that recognize how our time is deeply intertwined with the time of others, we can become advocates for the value of being students of waiting and recognize that there's value to wait times. There's also potential ways that wait times can disempower. And ultimately, we can unpack waiting's power and its promise, as well as its dangers. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Wow. Thank you, Professor Farman. Fascinating indeed. Well, rather than keep you all waiting any longer, it is my great pleasure to introduce our fourth and final panelist, Professor Jared Mizacci, who is Associate Director and Professor of Dance, Theater, Design, and Production at the University of Maryland School of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies. Mizacci's work spans the United States at notable theaters such as the Kennedy Center, Arena Stage, Woolly Mammoth Theater Company, Cornerstone Theater Company, Portland Center Stage at the Armory, South Coast Repertory, Here Art Center, and 3LD. In 2016, he received a New York City Obie Award, the Lucille Lortel and Henry Hughes Award for his work in Qui Win's Viet Gone at the Manhattan Theater Club. In December of 2020, the New York Times highlighted Jared on a list of the top 5 national artists making an impact during the pandemic. His work was also celebrated as a New York Times Critics' Pick on Sarah Gancher's Russian Troll Farm, where it was praised for being one of the first digitally native successes for virtual theater. His book, A Multimedia Designer's Method to Theatrical Storytelling, will be released in spring 2021-2022 through Routledge Publishers. He is a 2-time MacDowell Artist Fellow, a Princess Grace Award winner, and is the artistic director of Andy's Summer Playhouse. Jared is the CEO and founder of his production company, Virtual Design Collective, or VIDCO, which has helped over 50 theaters and performance vendors across the country with consultancies and productions in the virtual space during the pandemic. So without further ado, Professor Jared Mizacci.
There we go. Thank you, Lisa. Boy, the downside to being last is my mind is so full from all 3 of these really amazing thought exercises here. And just to consolidate that before I begin, I'm nourished by the need for closure, the force to wait, and the fear of imperfection as I'm about to kind of embark on what I would like to share with you about the pandemic and a time of really huge challenges in the live performing arts industry right now, as many of you know. In reflecting back on this, I'm thrust back to 2 specific memories I'd like to share with you. One is my sophomore year in college. I was in a philosophy class in which we were studying Aristotle, and the term being at work, staying itself came up as a hyphenated phrase. What does it mean to be a being at work, staying itself entity, to understand your actuality? And my professor, she held up a hammer and she said, "What is this?" And all the students were like, "Well, this is easy. It's a hammer." She said, "No, it's not. It's a piece of wood with a piece of metal on top of it." And then she brought out a 2x4 and a nail and she started hitting it. She said, "Now what is it?" And we're trying to be clever. And finally she was like, "This is a hammer. This is what it is doing. It is hammering the nail." Then she took out another 2x4 with a crooked nail and she started whacking at it, trying to get it in, and it wasn't going in at all. And she said, "What is it now?" And we're like, I bet it's, and she's like, "It's still a hammer, because it is doing the thing that it is meant to be doing and finding its essence in that. It's not sitting here saying, this nail is crooked. I will never be a hammer again. I must never do this," right? It was still trying to enact itself by continuing its duty. The worser situation is that it is sitting idle in a toolbox. She then took out a larger piece of wood with a bunch of crooked nails, and she turned it to us, and it was a portrait of her son. And she said, "Here's a bunch of crooked nails made by this hammer into a piece of art." And I've been thinking about that nonstop during the pandemic. The second memory is actually a very deeply personal one to me, in which I lost my father in 2004, very unexpectedly. And my mom, in one of the most profound memories I hold of her, sat next to him, and we were in the ICU unit. I was a disaster. I was 19, and it got really quiet. And to Jason's point, we were waiting, and also a high need for closure at that moment. And my mom sat there, and almost in a meditation, after 10 minutes of silence or so, she said, "You know, being a parent, I used to think that the success of a parent is to help your child avoid suffering at all costs." And she sat there and she looked at me and she said, "But I wonder now if it's actually about understanding that suffering is inevitable in life. We're human, we're mortal, and it is actually the need to teach your children how to suffer creatively through it all that makes life so important." And then she gave me a diatribe about don't stop doing theater, don't stop doing art. This is what we need right now in this moment. Both of those, for obvious and less obvious reasons, are what I've been meditating on during this pandemic, when we were hit in the performing arts industry with theater being shut down. No more means of telling stories the way that we know how to tell stories. I went back to the being at work, staying itself mentality, because I started asking myself, what is theater? What am I? Who am I? What is it that I need to do? And can I do it right now? Because actually what we were saying is theater inside a building with a collected group of people inside same building cannot exist due to the current circumstances. But at its core, can theater as an art form still exist? So I started asking myself, what is theater? And to me, theater is something that is being created and consumed simultaneously. There is no art object afterwards. It is just a moment. Liveness is a term that now I'm kind of holding on to with dear life, as every theater is making pieces of film, pre-recording and restreaming. That liveness at its core in the very beginning of this pandemic was what identified in me as me being a theater practitioner. And then I started remembering actually an additional part of my philosophy teacher's lesson, which was, she then said, however, this is a piece of wood and metal, as she held up that hammer, and she grabbed the metal by the hand and started hitting it on the table, and she grabbed another hammer and she started hitting it, and she said, now what is this? And we're like, oh, it's kind of drumsticks, right? And the idea of reverse engineering became a huge part of this practice in the pandemic, because I do believe that we, as we are right now, can still be telling stories in a live mechanism. We're on Zoom. I'm here talking to you. I'm able to embrace the things that were just spoken about and put them into this because I am not pre-recorded, and I am able to adapt. That is thrilling to me, and that to me is theater, even though we are not in a proscenium with a balcony. And so if we start at that core and we ask ourselves, what is Zoom? What is this tool that we have? I hear a lot of my theater colleagues saying Zoom is this horrible situation. Zoom readings, it's so dull, it's so boring. It's terrible to be able to even communicate to each other. And I said, okay, that's very subtractive. What is Zoom though? Let's forget the term Zoom and do what we did with the hammer. It is the ability to actually have upwards of 100 cameras worldwide connecting within a second or two of latency. That's brilliant. That's actually really thrilling to me. And put them into a software that can both push to one singular image or everybody together. If we take that at its base value and say, what can we do from there, then we can start to innovate again. And so I started experimenting throughout the pandemic. And this is to my last point of the term fearless. Our motto on campus is be fearless, which means we have to name what is fear so that we can be less of that. And in theater, I find there's a fear of perfection. We sign a contract to a very imperfect situation, and yet our fear of perfection sort of drives us, and specifically during the pandemic, that is very true. Now there is an art object. It is restreamable. It is not a temporal art form. And so what that is must be better than what we fear, which is an imperfect art object. And so I wanted to dispel that and start experimenting. And so I took what I thought of Zoom. It is this multi-camera setup in order to mix people together, and with the contract of liveness, and with the contract of the fact that we cannot be together, so let's suffer creatively. I brought a group of people together and we started experimenting. And so I have a couple of these here to show you. The first is I was able to take a camera, flip the camera, instead of it being, actually, sorry, I skipped ahead here. Instead of it being just a camera on the laptop, I started putting in a software that we use in theater to live video manipulate. So actually, I am in a software right now that looks like I'm just on Zoom, but I'm not. And as a result of that, I can actually do a lot of tricks in which is still just Zoom, but it is a live camera put into a software that can connect multi-cameras all over the world right now. So suddenly we have this mechanism to tell story. And so I want to show you just a couple of quick experiments and then finish up. So my first experiment was, how do we take a couple of people and mix them together? So I'm placing one person on Zoom who did a virtual background in black, and I placed him in my Zoom frame in order to show like he's a Tinkerbell on my shoulder, right? Again, this is just in Zoom. It's also live. We're able to communicate live. We're all laughing. We're all having a great time. Suddenly joy, suddenly bliss is back on track and is able to allow us to just be creative again. That might be the most crude thing I've ever made in my professional career, and yet it brought about hundreds of emails from people saying, how did you do that? What software were you using? And I was so proud to say, it's Zoom. It's the same software that you are using. And so we then continued forward to make a little bit less of a crude situation, place the same person in my Zoom frame, and add some other filters to it, which is blurring and deep blurring, and starting to create an emulated cinematic event in which it looks like a rack focus, right? All of these things are actually very simple things inside the theater lexicon of technology, but because for some reason we were sitting on Zoom feeling as though we were sad that the old ways were no longer, I felt like we were all blinded to the fact that we had all these tools at our fingertips. And so the last one that I wanted to show is one of our final experiments here, which was just putting a little bit more music to it and finding a little theme to it. So I just wanted to show one last thing just to give you, oops, here we go. Cool. So with all of those, I should also say that all three of those were experiments we did each day. And one of the tasks that I put to the group was, let's make an experiment once a day for 2 weeks. We did 14 experiments that were each about 45 seconds long. And I told everyone it must be live. I told everyone that imperfection is our trophy. And I told everyone it must be public facing so that everyone can see what we are doing, because I don't want, as Jason was saying, others waiting for theater to reopen only to hear that we had exclusively discovered all of this innovation. And so we started putting it out on Facebook, on Instagram. We've opened up 2-hour sessions once every other week to learn the software so that new people can come to it and experiment with it. Because, and this is where I want to end, in being fearless to this moment and just being messy and reverse engineering the tools that we actually do have instead of longing for the ones we used to have or hoping for the ones that we may or may not get later, we have a great challenge ahead of us that the pandemic has really exposed, which is to say that if we are messy and if we are embracing of the mess that all of these tools can provide us right now, then we avoid erroneously labeling innovation as failure. And when we look at these things, they are grainy, they are choppy, but there's a seed of an idea in it. And what I don't want to have happen is people say, it's grainy, let's not do it. Or it's choppy, let's not do it. Instead, embrace that. And again, as my mom said in the ICU unit, suffer creatively. We have each other and we each have tools. Let's be public about that and get rid of the perfectionists in all of us and just tinker and be the hammer, even if the nail is crooked. So thank you.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists for sharing with us today, this afternoon. I'm very excited. We're going to be moving into our question and answer portion for today's event. So if you in our audience have a question that you would like one of our panelists to answer, please feel free to use the Q&A feature that you'll find on your screen. We might not be able to get to everyone's question, but we'll try to get through as many as we can. So without further ado, I believe I'm going to jump forward and ask. We have our first question for our Q&A session. And our first question is actually going to be for Professor Kruglanski. And the question is, when you notice your own desire to a decision too quickly or your own closed-mindedness, what do you do about it?
That's a very good question, because I find that I have a very strong need for closure. I cannot tolerate uncertainty, but I know that about myself. So when I feel very confident that it's time to act, that my decision is the correct one, I remember that I have this need for closure, and I allow myself to maybe consider the other point of view. When I receive a critique of my paper, my tendency is to dismiss it and reject it. And but I know that I'm a high need for closure person. So know thyself, as Socrates has advised us, comes very handy, because then I know that I'm vulnerable in that regard, and therefore I act on it, and I stop in myself in my tracks and try to consider alternative points of view.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. So I have our next question. Our next question is coming in, and this question is for Dr. Farman. Dr. Farman, do we need to design wait time into our systems, technologies, and creative practices to help us temper the speed of the digital age? And what might that look like, and what might it help us to understand, produce, or imagine?
Great. A lot of both designers and creatives are asking this kind of question. One of the projects that comes to mind is Marina Abramovic's collaboration with Igor Levitt with the Goldberg variations. When it was performed, you as an audience member had to enter the space, drop everything off in a locker, including your watch and your phone. You had nothing on you, and you were given a set of noise canceling headphones, and you entered the Park Avenue Armory, and you sat in a deck chair, and you put on the headphones collectively when a gong sounded, and you had to wait collectively for 30 minutes before the Goldberg variations started, with Igor Levitt playing that. So we all had to sit. I didn't go to this. I watched many reviews of the performance, but Marina Abramovic's perspective here was exactly that we have to design waiting into our art, into our interfaces, into how we interact with the world, because right now there is no pause. There is no ability. She's like, you cannot go into the Park Avenue Armory and listen to Igor Levitt play Goldberg. That you walk in off the street, you are totally unprepared to listen to this piece because of the pace of life, because of the hecticness of it. So she designed it into the system where it's a required 30-minute wait time. And then when the 30 minutes were over, you took off the headphones and listened to Igor Levitt play the piano. Designers are confronting this all the time as well, where they're building intentional delays into systems, whether it is to create a kind of experience that is missing in much of life today, where there's an app, for example, that you take your pictures on, but you don't get to see them for 3 days, kind of harkening back to the when you used to get your film developed, and the joy of discovering something that you don't know instantly what it's going to be. To also companies like Facebook building in delays into their very systems. There's a anecdote about them designing a scan of your Facebook profile that would see what sort of security vulnerabilities you had. And when people ran this scan of your system, it was a very quick code. It spit back the results right away. And Facebook noticed that people weren't changing any of their settings. And what they found out was it was so fast that people didn't trust it. So they had to actually build in delays because we associate delays often with thoroughness. So Facebook then inserted this little bit of code into that security scan that made the system wait. So it scanned your profile, it paused, and then it gave you the results. And then people began changing their settings like crazy because they imagined that it was more thorough in that sense. So I think in the digital age, a key question is about the pace of life, how quickly we're getting information. Do we have time to process that information? Do we have time to sit with it? And how can we as designers and creatives build in moments of pause within our very work, which in many ways it's missing from day-to-day life. And I think it's a really key question. And where that comes from, does it come from the top down, from designers, from creatives like us, or is it something we have sort of push from the bottom up to implement in our lives? I think these are some key, interesting questions.
Thank you, Professor Farman. So this is a question that's actually come through for all of our panelists, but I'd love to turn it over to Professor Song to start us off. Following Dr. Kruglanski's schema, what's the greatest danger for you, right? Premature closure or overanalysis, paralysis, and never reaching closure. And feel free to pass that on to a colleague as well, if you'd like.
I guess I have to divulge a little bit of my personal life here, because my constant struggle in the last year has really been with premature closure. I have a 3-year-old daughter, and we're a single parent family, and you know, just trying to keep us alive and healthy, and it has really sort of truncated a lot of what I would have in the past had such creative luxury in terms of time and just imagining. And so unfortunately, I'm not sure that I'm able to answer that from a sort of blank slate. So I'd love to pass it on to someone else.
Yeah, go ahead, Jared.
Yeah, closure, I'm speaking strictly from the theater industry right now, which is a very binary, is it theater, is it not theater, is it live performance, is it not live performance, which frustrates me because I have now grown to realize my partner is a studio artist, she's a painter, and she said the thing that is always baffling about theater is that iteration is kind of shunned upon, like that you're working through something always. And so for me, the notion of premature is like, it's tricky right now, because I personally hope that our industry actually moves away from closure or a binary statement of something that is or isn't, and just says, how can we fulfill the best version of this thing? And so for me, the question being, premature closure or overanalysis or paralysis, I think that's why I am about like do, just keep chiseling at the thing, just do. And later you'll look back and say, this is a work of art this time, not that one piece and this one piece and that one piece. And I think that will be a really helpful tool in our industry, at least, is do, and then, you know, the blue period occurred for Picasso. It's not, you know, it's an era of time, and I'm excited to get away from closure or over analysis and actually just feel our impulses again, because I think we are over analytical in theater right now.
Yes, go ahead, Professor Kruglanski.
Yes, I was struck by the fact that, you know, given that my problem is premature closure and closure in general, I was struck how Professor Farman's idea of waiting can be extremely useful. When I'm busy doing, it's very difficult for me to be creative. I'm jumping from one decision to the next, and it's very difficult to innovate. I innovate when I'm, you know, busy doing other things. When I'm sleeping, waking up at night. Most of my ideas come during insomnia, when I am waiting to fall asleep. This is when the ideas come, and I try to write them down, because when I'm engaged in doing, closure takes over, and my creativity is stifled. So I found that this idea of waiting is really a very profound thing that resonates to my own experience in coming up with novelty, with innovation.
Excellent. So I have some more questions that are coming through. Professor Farman, did you want to answer that question, or should we move forward? All right. Go right ahead.
Sorry, we can move on. Yeah, this is great. Thank you.
I also wanted to open the floor for the panelists. If any of you have questions for each other, you're also welcome. Just wave your hand, let me know. I'm happy to open space for that. And if not, this next question is actually for Professor Song. Marin, this question comes from a music theorist who's wondering how much theoretical issues come up in the piano lessons that you teach. How often do you discuss questions of harmony, voice leading, motivic relationships, phrase structure, large-scale musical form, etc. in your lessons, and how much do they influence your interpretations and those of your students?
So I actually have a second master's degree in music theory. So the answer in short is a lot. I'm constantly talking to my students about phrase structure, about form, about harmony, about melody. But what I would say that I did not learn during my studies, which has sort of come about organically, is the sense of where could the composer have gone in a different direction? What makes this piece of music or art, genius? And why do we have the experience that this is unusual? And what is it that in the human experience resonates with that and say, doesn't with so-called lesser pieces of music? So that has been kind of an interesting development. I have become more interested in the idea of improvisation. For instance, if I get stuck in a certain area of interpretation in a piece, what could I have done differently? What could the composer have done differently? And suddenly there's a fresh pair of ears there. So I have been very encouraging of my students to examine, but at the same time, once the examination is done, not to get paralyzed by this overanalysis, but just kind of release and trust the process is going to take hold, and you can digest what you've actually thought. So.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a question that's come through for Professor Farman, and then I also believe that Professor Mizacci has a question for the group that will probably round us out for today. But Professor Farman, the question is the idea that time is distributed inequitably that you discussed in your presentation. Can you talk about some more examples or unpack that just a little further for us in about maybe a minute?
Absolutely. Yeah, this came to mind for me standing in line at the grocery store on a busy Saturday morning. There was a woman at the front with a toddler in her cart, and she was paying for her groceries in part with cash and then in part with food stamps. And she had a pile of coupons that she was making sure were counted correctly. And there were a couple of people in front of me in line who turned around and looked at me and rolled their eyes and sighed like, this woman is wasting our time. She doesn't realize, she's taking up our valuable time on a busy Saturday morning with all of the coupons and having the manager come over because something was mispriced, and everybody's groaning and getting frustrated with the process of checking the woman out. And I thought at that moment how there are inequities when it comes to the expectations of how you're supposed to use your time, as people are asked to use it in just dramatically different ways. There was a meme that was passed around that said, Beyonce has the same 24 hours you do. Why aren't you Beyonce? You know, and the fact is, Beyonce, with her extraordinary wealth, has a very different relationship to time than I do. You know, or other people. So when it comes to people's ability to skip lines entirely because of wealth, for example, and not have to wait in the same kinds of ways, waiting is not distributed in the same kinds of ways. We're asked to wait in really radically different ways that often reiterate your status within society and keep you often disempowered because you don't have those same 24 hours in a day.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Farman. So to round us out, this will be our last question for today. I'd like to actually pass it over to Jared. Jared, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm struck by the word "do" between all of us because I think there's slight differences, and so I'd love to. I realized as I was saying "do," it means there's an act of meditation of tinkering, and that's in comparison to produce, which is in theater the action point of what it is. And I'm thinking about the term imagination happens in daydreaming. And that is our art form too. And so I'm interested because we all come from very different vantage points of just the definition of do versus wait, and where meditation falls inside of that, and daydreaming. Just because I think we speak of it a little differently, which I love. Like that's a really helpful thing to hear. So I just wanted to offer that it's more of an ellipsis than a question, but to speak to that would be helpful.
I just have one thought on that before hearing from the other panelists. That was a key shift in my own thinking about this, when waiting is not simply an in-between of doing, which is often how we think of it, but waiting as a doing in and of itself. That was a dramatic shift for my own perceptions of how I spend time. If waiting itself is an act of doing, what is the meaning of that act? And I think that that's a really profound shift, where it's not simply an in-between. It is itself its own fulfillment in time, and has its own meanings if we can identify them.
Yes, I want to take this opportunity to comment on the great admiration I have for Professor Mezzocchi's approach. People feel that uncertainty is angst-provoking, that anxiety is anxiety-provoking, that it produces a desire to escape from the uncertainty. Uncertainty is what you make of it, actually. You can explore the uncertainty creatively, see what it can do, and that's exactly what you have done with your group, creative discovery of new possibilities that the uncertainty affords. So, you know, some people are afraid of uncertainty because they think of all the negative things, all the limitations, all the constraints. But if you think of uncertainty in a positive way, and there are ways of, you know, approaching it optimistically, approaching it with curiosity, approaching it with a spirit of adventure. And I think, you know, we have experimental data that when we direct people's attention to the things that you can do in a situation of uncertainty, discover its possibilities, people feel free, people feel unconstrained, people feel good about the situation. When you think about the things that you cannot do, then they feel angst, then they feel depressed, then they feel down. So I think it's all in your mind, in a word.
It was striking to me. It was just your story, Jason, of the woman in line with her toddler. I'd be curious to know what the toddler's experience of waiting was. For me and my daughter, she doesn't seem to wait. I mean, in that when I am waiting with her, she's creating stuff, she's playing, she's thinking about the, you know, and when I'm able to enter her world of meditation or imagination, I feel so much better. It's a real stress buster. So I've just been very grateful for that experience.
Thank you for those answers. It's really inspiring. Thank you.
And I'm just going to pick it up from there and just say a deep, heartfelt thank you to our 4 panelists. It's been such a pleasure as someone who's often kind of siloed in my school, my area. It's always a joy to hear what other colleagues are researching and thinking about and questioning. So on behalf of the RHU Collegiate Council, I'd also like to thank our dean for your support of our programming, and again, the speakers for their thoughtful contributions on this important topic. So special thanks are due to the Collegiate Council for conceptualizing this event, and especially to Dan Zimmerman, who really made this happen for us, to Lauren Campbell, who's been organizing and orchestrating everything behind the scenes, and to our president of Collegiate Council, Max, for all of your help and support, and to everyone behind the scenes who's made this possible as well. You know who you are. So thank you to all the students, staff, faculty, and guests who've joined us in this important conversation, and we hope you'll continue discussing these issues in your own conversations in the future. Please have a peaceful and productive day, everyone, and we'll see you next year for next year's plenary. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.